Alrighty. So before we get into our newest chapter, I wanted to make a couple of notes. The first is I remembered to change it to chapter 8 for everything except this title page. So if you're looking at the slides, it says chapter 9. That's just because I've taught this specific chapter for another course, and it was chapter 9 there, and I assumed that they were the same, which they are not. It's interesting. So here, chapter 8 for language and thought is part of 104, and I've taught at other schools where they actually lump it in with 105, the more social side of intro psych. And I find it fits so much better here with 104 because I get to talk about like different parts of the brain and different modes of processing that we've already covered in this class. So instead of having to hope that you remember from some previous semester, it's something that we covered just a few weeks ago, which is so much of an improvement. But yeah, so you'll notice that there's a couple of things where I have to sift through my notes just a little bit because I had been ready for a much deeper explanation, but we don't need it. The other thing I wanted to note was I've actually gone through and looked at the content that I have for the rest of the semester, and we're actually in a really good place to have a lot of room at the end. Because I had been talking about using this Friday as sort of stop lecture early and give people a chance to go over their exams. But instead of making people who might not want to be here and might not care about their exams come in just for a partial lecture, I think what I'm going to do is just use Friday as an exam viewing, ask questions about your assignments, that sort of thing session. So we'll have lecture Monday and Wednesday, and then Friday will be sort of a free period where we can chat about stuff, go over your tests and that sort of thing. And then we'll resume and finish off the chapter next week on Monday and Wednesday. And we should finish with enough time that Friday, our last day of class, can actually be a review period. So if you have questions or want to go back over anything from the semester, we can do it during that class. And then that way we won't finish early, but we also won't be running long either. So that's the plan. I've already made a little note on our Moodle page, but I'm also going to send out an announcement for those who are not here, but just so that we know what our plan is. Okay, and so when we actually get into the concept, we're going to start talking about language and thought. And the first time I taught this chapter, I thought that it was a very strange combination. It seemed weird to cover language and then also to look at how we think about things. But the way that the chapter, or the way that the textbook presents it, is sort of this nice transition between language and how we use language and sort of how we learn language, but then also this transition over into how the way that we talk about things starts affecting the way that we think about things. And so our language ends up influencing our thoughts and vice versa. So we're going to get into that transition probably at the beginning of next week. So for now, we're going to focus on language, but that's our end goal, is to kind of transition over into how our language and our way of speaking will sort of affect how we think about things. But of course, if we're going to start a new topic, we're going to start with the big question, which is, what is our topic? What is language? And so language is another one of those kind of hard to concretely define things. So when we talk about language, we're saying that it consists of a system of symbols and rules. So there are sort of symbols, things that represent other things, and there are rules for combining those symbols. We all have to understand the same rules to be able to get meaning from it. And combining these different symbols can generate a theoretically infinite number of possible meanings and messages. So we're actually highlighting 4 distinct properties of language from these 2 statements. Symbols and rules would refer to the fact that language is symbolic and structured. Generative is talking about that infinite generations possible of different meanings and messages that we can put together. And then semantics would be the meanings themselves. So those are our 4 things that are actually highlighted on the next slide. And then we're going to go into each of those properties sort of on their own a little bit later on. And we can talk about psycholinguistics, which is the scientific study of the psychological aspects of language. So things like how people understand, produce, and acquire language, that would be that psycholinguistics umbrella. So it's not just the language itself that we're studying, but it's the people who are producing that language and how we interact with it. So we're going to really be leaning into sort of the social aspects of language and how language between people is a thing, as opposed to, say, just linguistics on its own, which would focus on the language itself and care less about the people, theoretically. Over the weekend while I was grading, one of the birds was helping and has removed the down arrow on my laptop. So we can no longer scroll down without the mouse. I will have to replace that. It keeps sneaking up on me. I got in the habit of it, and then it happened again, and then I just have to laugh. But yes, someday I'll find that key. So these are our 4 properties, as I just described: symbolic, semantic, generative, and structured. And I'm going to talk about each of these sort of on their own in-depth things, because in the first class, I explained them each here and then went on and realized that what I had explained matched the slides. So we're just going to go to the slides so you can see what I'm saying while I'm saying it. So when we talk about this symbolic nature of language, we're talking about the fact that we're using sounds and signs and gestures and maybe even visual signals to represent things. So I kind of like framing this as when we're looking at perception and we talk about a stimulus, that can be kind of anything. So stimulus is our generic term. For language, a symbol is a generic term. It can be a sound, a sign, a gesture, an image, whatever we want it to be. And most of the language studies are going to be framed around spoken language. We're going to delve a little bit into written language, but there's also, like, you can consider all of this for signed language. And a lot of the same divisions and the same considerations would apply to any and all of those different types of language. It's just because of simplicity, the textbook focuses on one way of doing it. But I always try and make people aware that it isn't just one kind of language. And so with these symbols, we can specifically talk about the fact that these symbols are arbitrary. And what that means is that there's nothing that really connects the sound or the shape of the word that we're using to the thing that it's representing. So if we think of the word dog, the shape of the word, the 3 letters don't mean anything, and the sound of the word doesn't necessarily connect it directly to the creature, but through association, we've learned that using those words, that is talking about that particular kind of creature. So it's an arbitrary symbol, and once we understand the meaning, once we have learned the rules of this symbol goes with this thing, then we can start communicating. It starts allowing us to form and transfer mental representations. So by forming mental representations, I'm talking about taking ideas and concepts of our own mind and bringing it out into the world. Maybe you want to write something down. Maybe you're writing a story. Maybe you're doing an assignment and you're trying to get across an argument. You're taking some kind of mental understanding of a concept and putting it on paper to give to someone else. And once you put that out in the world, you can actually share your thoughts, your internalizations with that individual. So you're transferring that information to them. And so this is, again, sort of the basis of language. We're sharing information. And as psychologists, we care on that process of information from me to you. So this lecture is me taking my understanding of language, verbalizing it, and hopefully having it have some meaning for you. We can also look at, for our structure, we have rules that determine how things go together. We can talk about grammar, which is a set of rules that dictate how our different symbols and things get combined to create meaningful units of communication. if I especially like talking about language learning. So when we learn our first language, when we learn our native language, we don't necessarily become aware of all of these rules. We learn through experience. There's a lot of operant conditioning of you're rewarded for saying things the right way and corrected if you say it the wrong way. But when you're trying to learn, say, a second language, you start having it taught to you in a much more structured way. So for myself, I took French classes all through elementary school, all through high school. And then when the pandemic started, I sat down and I took French again. That was I'm stuck at the computer and miserable anyways, I might as well make it worse. So I've been doing French for 2 years. And it's like they present things in a very different way where, okay, so intuitively, I would structure a sentence in a particular way for English. But if you've learned French, there's a lot of words where they flip it, where the order that you would put it in English is the opposite of what you would order it in French. And so different languages will have different rules on this order of words. And even the way that they pluralize things, the fact that in French, even things that are not themselves gendered are then gendered words. So you have to know if a table is masculine or feminine. It gets really complex, and it's something that my brain was not set up for because I didn't do a lot of French learning early on. So I had to acquire a new grammar. I had to acquire a new set of rules to help govern all of those new combinations to make sense. And it isn't actually any easier to learn English. English is awful because a lot of our grammar, a lot of our rules around the structure and order of things in our language, there are lots of exceptions. So if you think of I before E except after C, and then there's an asterisk that says also except in these other words where it's the opposite. So we learn about a lot of these things, again, through trial and error, through experience. So that's our structure and our symbols. What about the semantics? Language conveys meaning. That's the whole point of it. We're giving information to someone else. So when we talk about semantics, we're talking about the meanings of the words and sentences that we're putting together. And we've used the term semantics before in this class, always as semantics being meanings behind things. And so we've already talked about we're transferring information, we're transferring meanings, sharing things between people. And I always like to point out that the concept of information is another one of those contentious terms in the field. My own research is very close to language research because I study communication in non-human animals. I look at how chickadees communicate between each other using their chickadee calls. And their calls are arbitrary, maybe they could be generative. They have 4 different note types that are combined in a structured order. A notes come before B's, which come before C's, which come before D's, and they can have multiple or omit any of those note types in a very particular order. After 8 years of looking at chickadee calls, I saw one vocalization that violated their rules, that violated the grammar for chickadees. So we tried to publish something that talked about order being meaningful. And the terms language, semantics, and information are all very contentious in the field. There's a lot of tiptoeing around what you're trying to say especially when looking at non-human communication. So it's interesting. Even communication itself could be considered contentious. So a couple of interesting little encounters. So just keep in mind that the terms we're using only apply directly to human language, but there can be parallels in other species, which is quite fun. So that was a little bit of a tangent, but okay, so next we're going to look at generativity. So as I said before, this is that fact that we can combine our symbols into words and words into sentences, and we can have an infinite number of messages that can have novel meanings. So there's no limit on what we can describe using our language. and especially where language is constantly evolving. As technology advances, new words are created to describe new things that are happening. And so new words are incorporated into the language, and we start seeing sort of this increasingly complex interpretation of language. So that's really, really cool. And again, infinite being sort of theoretically infinite. We can't necessarily count them all, but it's a pretty big combination amount. And one of the really cool things about language is that the complexity here permits displacement. And this is the idea that we can communicate about events and objects that are not physically present. So if you think of a toddler who's just learning how to speak, most of the time they're going to be talking about things that they can see and hear and point to. They're going to talk about the toy that's next to them, or they want that thing that they can't quite reach, but they can point to it. So it's all the here and the now. But as our language skills get more and more complex, we can start talking about things that aren't physically present, events that aren't actually happening. We can say that it is going to rain. It isn't raining right now, but it will in the future. We can talk about things that happened in the past. Last winter was extra cold, or whatever. So we aren't really restricted to talking about here and now. We can talk about past and future along with the present. And we can talk about imaginary or theoretical events. We can talk about things that haven't quite happened or that couldn't happen, but we can change our sort of interpretations. And so these can all be symbolically represented. So that kind of helps add into that flexibility of language. And then if we wanted to sort of dabble a little bit back into our meaning before we move on into our hierarchical structure, we can talk about the difference between surface and deep structure. And so this is basically the difference between what is physically being said and what you actually mean. So our surface structure is looking at the symbols, the things that are being combined. What words are we using in what particular order? So we're looking at things like syntax. How are we combining these concepts? And syntax is a subset of our grammar. So what words have we used in which order? What are we saying? Next, for deep structure, this is the underlying meaning of those combined symbols. These are the semantics, the sort of rules of connecting those symbols with meaning. And so we can have differences between our surface and deep structure even within the same sentences. So I'm going to come up with I'm going to use a couple of examples. I've learned that I have to write these down because I'm bad at on-the-spot examples. But if we want two sentences that have different surface structure but the same deep structure, we can say that Mary went to the zoo or Mary visited the zoo. Different words, same concept. So we've used slightly different words, but they get across the same idea. But what if we have a sentence that it's just one sentence, the same surface structure, but it has an ambiguous meaning? We can have multiple deep structures. And the example for this is the statement that the police must stop drinking after midnight. We could interpret this as the police should be doing their job and stop others from drinking after midnight. Or maybe the police themselves should not be drinking after midnight. So that's an ambiguous meaning. We have multiple deep structures, and we could vary that, I guess, depending on our inflection in that sentence. We could make it more likely to be interpreted one way or the other, depending on where we put our emphasis. And when we have conversations, we hear the surface structure, we hear the words that are being used in the particular order that they are being used in, but that's not necessarily what sticks with us. So when you're sitting in a lecture, you hear the words that I'm telling you, but you don't necessarily write down word for word everything that I've said. You summarize it, you get the gist of it, and you put that on paper. And when you walk away, you're going to be remembering that deep structure, not necessarily the exact words that were used. All right, and so this brings us to our hierarchical structure of language. And I'm actually going to show you what we're working towards because I find that we're going to be showing a bunch of different words and a bunch of different meanings, but we're building towards this diagram here. So you can think about this kind of like a pyramid, and at the bottom we have our small pieces, their individual elements. And as they add up and build together, we go from sort of lots of individual things up to a single larger concept. So we're going to move from our phonemes to morphemes to words, phrases, and sentences. And so you're going to find that the phonemes and morphemes, people don't tend to have an understanding of those quite yet. So those we take a little bit more time with. But when we get into words and phrases and sentences, those are things that you're used to. Those are concepts that you're familiar with. So we don't have to spend as much time there. So instead, we're going to focus on the distinction between sort of the bottom three, because there's a little bit of overlap there. So we'll come back to this, having explained each of these categories. But we're going to start at the bottom with our phonemes. And so phonemes are our smallest units of sound that are recognizable as separate sounds. So these aren't necessarily individual letters, because if you've ever thought about it, say the letter A. There are lots of different ways that you can say the letter A. Cat versus car are very different sounds, different A sounds. So even though the letters are the same, the sounds are different. And so a linguist would specify, is it a long A or a short A? And they'd have symbols to denote those different phonemes, those different sounds based on the word that it's being used in. And so humans can produce hundreds of phonemes. When we're born, we're actually able to produce all possible phonemes. As we will see when we get into development, as babies, when we babble, we produce all sorts of different sounds. So we'll produce sounds that are sort of used in the tongue that our parents speak, but also for any other language. That's why children who are adopted into families that speak other languages can speak those languages no problem if they're young enough. As we get older, as we sort of start hearing one particular language, we're going to adopt only those phonemes used in that language. We lose the others. And so you're going to find that, again, with language learning, maybe if we're going from English to French, there are certain sort of rolled R sounds that you just can't quite do if you haven't been doing French long enough. And that's because those would be phonemes that are present in French but not in English. And I'm not capable of that. And so no language is going to use all of them. We see English sits somewhere in the middle. We have about 44 phonemes for English. We can have as many as 80 in some languages, or as few as only 14. So there's quite a range there, but none of them are using all of them. And it makes it hard to sort of jump between them if you don't have the same phonemes. All right, so phonemes, smallest units of sound, those individual sounds that make things up. Next, we're jumping to our morphemes. So these are our smallest units specifically of meaning. So the phonemes are sounds, and then the morphemes are meanings. So morphemes are going to be combinations of phonemes. And so if we have, in English, again, about 44 phonemes, they can combine into more than 100,000 morphemes. So we start seeing that generative quality of language. As we move up, we have more and more possible combinations. And so here, we have to sort of make a little bit of a distinction. So morphemes are specifically units that have meaning and small units that have meaning. So morphemes can be single syllable words. So things like hat and bat would be both words and morphemes because they are single syllables and they are also words. But there are other morphemes that aren't quite a full syllable. So something like the letter S. The letter S would be considered a morpheme because it modifies another word. So if we have the word bat and add an S to it, now we're talking about multiple bats. So that single letter is changing something. It has meaning on its own. And so S and other suffixes, ed, those would count as morphemes even though they themselves aren't words. This also works for prefixes. So things that sort of add on to other words, those can be morphemes themselves. All right, so some words can be morphemes, but not all morphemes are words. And then if we want to look at, so with words, we said, okay, so some words are also morphemes, but some words are multiple morphemes. They are combinations of morphemes. So words are going to be larger. They are the combinations, that next step up. So if we go from our morphemes, the 100,000 of those, up into English words, we're looking at 500,000 or more individual words. So again, bigger and bigger as we go up. And then phrases are a conceptual unit, a combination of words that can stand together as a conceptual unit, a concept. And then we can combine phrases into sentences. So again, we don't have to spend as much time on these because these ones make logical sense. But let's look at that comparison from our smallest units all the way up to our full sentences. And so at the very bottom here, our phonemes, you'll notice that there are some letters and some letter-like symbols. These are actually symbols that are used by linguists that stand for particular sounds. It's kind of like when you look something up in the dictionary and it shows the pronunciation guide. Those are these symbols. So it's telling you what you're saying and how you're saying it. So from those sounds, we can go up to our morphemes, our simplest units of meaning. So the is a morpheme. It's actually also a sound. So it's a phoneme on its own. That's sort of one of those standalone sounds. So the would be a morpheme and a word because it stands on its own. But our next word, players, that can be broken down into multiple morphemes. We have the word play, and then we have the suffixes and s. Player meaning those who are playing, and then s meaning plural. So and s would each be their own morpheme. And they combine together into players. And then we can have the players is a phrase. And then the players talked to the fans is the whole sentence. So we kind of build up that way. All right, so now that we have the terminology there, we're going to start looking at, okay, how do we actually interpret and produce language? First on the interpret scale, but then we're going to move into some of our language areas in the brain, and we'll see how far we get there. But this is another one of those sections where I'm really grateful that we've already covered these concepts. So I don't have to hope that you remember bottom-up and top-down processing because we've done them fairly recently. So back when we were talking about sensation and perception, we had talked about bottom-up and top-down processing. Bottom-up processing was focusing on our individual elements of a stimulus that are analyzed separately and then combined in order to form a unified perception. So starting big at the bottom and combining upward. And so if we look at our letter B on the screen, we have different receptors or different neurons in our brain that respond to lines of different orientations. So we'd have a vertical line response and a horizontal line response. So we could say, okay, well, it's got the vertical spine and the horizontal lines and then the rounded bumps. It must be a letter B. Now we do find that a lot of language, while we're learning a language, we definitely rely on this bottom-up processing. A child learning to read is going to sound out each letter. And once they've sounded out all the letters, they're going to figure out which word that is. Then they sound out the next word. And then they're going to put the two words together and they sound out the next word. So it's definitely a bottom-up process. But once we start understanding these rules, once we have a better understanding of how things fit together, we can just look at words and understand what they are. So we then switch over to our top-down processing. So this says that sensory information is interpreted in light of existing knowledge, concepts, ideas, and expectations. Again, we come back to that idea of mental sets, which are basically perceptual expectations, rules or frameworks that we can work with in order to interpret the stimuli. And these mental sets are especially helpful when we have ambiguous stimuli. So if someone is talking and you don't quite hear what they say, you can usually fill in the blanks based on the context in which it was said. I know that my hearing is not great, and especially now that I can't read lips, it's a lot harder to figure out what people are saying. So I find that I have to rely a lot on these mental sets to say, well, I caught this word and the end of the sentence, so they must be asking me this. And we do really well at this. Our brains are set up to fill in these gaps, and we don't even realize that we're always doing it. So language is massively relying on top-down processing because everything we're looking at, everything we're hearing, is framed based on our pre-existing knowledge. We have an existing vocabulary, we have grammar, we have rules, everything that helps us structure what we're saying, but also what we're hearing. All right, and so this is especially important for something like speech segmentation. And this is a little bit of an aside here, where if we think about it, so speech segmentation is just how we perceive the breaks in between words. So when someone is speaking, if we were looking at a spectrogram, which is what I spend a lot of my life doing, it's just a graph where on our y-axis we have our frequency, amplitude is in darkness or intensity, and then the x-axis is time. So we just look at sort of squiggles in time. And so if you look at human speech, it is a disgusting mess of squiggles over time. And there are very, very few breaks. Especially now that I've been recording and editing my own lectures, I find it's really hard to find a break point because run-on sentences. And so our brains are really good at relying on these mental sets to figure out where does the period go? Where are these different words and what are these different words? But in recent years, we've started to see that AI has started to catch up to this a little bit. The best example is in the last 2 or 3 years, YouTube subtitles are actually legible now. The automatically generated ones, they're not half bad. And I find I rely on those fairly heavily for my online classes. And I'm careful about how I enunciate things just so that YouTube can figure out what I'm saying. But in the past, it used to be pretty much unintelligible, especially for scientific topics. I've tried before to record and use subtitles, and it was awful because it didn't have the vocabulary. It didn't understand those technical words. But in recent years, it's starting to catch up. The reason why it has so much trouble is because our brains are a lot more complex and our mental sets allow us to pick stuff out a lot better. If we think about things like pauses in our speech, especially as someone who tends to run words into each other, I tend to try and focus in or space out my pronunciation, especially on important terms or terms that can sound very similar. So a great example of this is when we were looking at binocular and monocular cues. I stress the prefix, the bi or mon, and there's a space there. So binocular, there's more of a space between the first part of the word and the second part of the word than there was between binocular and cues because I was running that together. And so a computer program would try and separate the two syllables of one word from each other because there was a larger gap, and they would leave two separate words together because the gap was smaller. And so our brains are able to figure that out. We can accommodate those sort of variances where we have larger spaces within words than we do between words. And we can even have larger spaces within words than we do between entire sentences. But computers had a lot of trouble with that because it's less predictable and it's a lot It's based a lot on experience and intuition. So we're really good at it, and artificial intelligence, not so much. But they're getting complex enough now that they're doing a much, much better job. All right, so tangent over. Another thing we want to focus in on is the social context of language. And so pragmatics is the knowledge of the practical aspects of using language. So these are kind of like our rules of communication, things that we need to keep in mind. And so again, we're leaning into that idea that with communication, especially for a psychology class, we care about those social interactions. And so we're going to be looking beyond just the words themselves, the surface structure, and we're going to be looking at the deep structure and how different aspects can actually change that pretty dramatically. So if we think of this idea of, do you have the time to explain this concept? Or do you have the time of day? Both are asking about the time, but they're referring to very different types of time. So one is saying, okay, do you have some free time where we can sit down and discuss something? And the other one is saying, what does your watch say? Very, very different things from the exact same words. So we have to imply meaning, that deep structure, from the rest of the sentence. So when we're interpreting information, it's a lot more than just having a vocabulary and the grammar to correctly arrange those words. Our context, and especially our social context, has a huge role in this. So I especially like the example of sarcasm. Sarcasm is something that doesn't always hit. I grew up with one of my best friends who had no concept of sarcasm. We did not get along for very large periods of time until I figured that out. But that's where your surface structure, so you could say, again, back to the example of your friend talking about nailing the test. If you ask them how you did and they said, yeah, it went well, you know that that's sarcasm. You know that that's the exact opposite of what happened. They did terribly on that test. But if we were just looking at the surface, then we would say that, yeah, it went well, but it didn't. And then we also want to consider the roles of the individuals exchanging information. Again, levels upon levels. But if you think about it, talking to, say, your friends is very different than talking to, say, an instructor or a parent or a boss. There's all of these different sort of social constructs that we have to consider. And there's sort of this idea of using the correct tone and the correct language. So I keep my conversations fairly formal. I use proper terminology because that's what I'm teaching you. We could simplify this to sort of non-scientific terms, but that doesn't really help on a test. And if we use the wrong tone or the wrong sort of message or whatever, we can violate that pragmatics. We go against our knowledge of those practical aspects of language. So we're applying language incorrectly. So again, lots of things to consider here. But the last thing that I wanted to cover today was to just sort of refresh our memory about some of the different areas of the brain that we've talked about, and especially how they pertain to language. So if you remember, we really focused in on Wernicke's area and Broca's area, so our blue and our orange dots. And so let's start with Wernicke's area, the blue dot over our temporal lobe. And so that's in a great spot where, again, typically we think about language in terms of spoken language. So Wernicke's area is right near our primary auditory cortex, which would be sort of just below and to the right, still on the temporal lobe, but just a little bit off from there. So that's where our incoming auditory information would be, which makes sense. This is our temporal lobe, that's where our ears are. But also, as I mentioned, we can have visual components of language. So the occipital lobe contains our primary visual cortex. That's also pretty handy. So the primary visual cortex and the primary auditory cortex can both send information to our Wernicke's area. And it's going to be responsible for understanding speech. It's going to interpret the things that we're hearing in the context of all that we know about language. What phrases are we expecting? Who are we talking to? All of those things would come together. And then our Wernicke's area isn't too far from Broca's area. And Broca's area is related to speech formation. So when we're listening to a conversation, when someone's talking to us, we're probably interpreting what they're saying. We're taking it from that surface level to the deep level. What's the meaning here? But also when you're having a conversation, people are typically waiting for a response. There's a back and forth. So while you're interpreting, you're also going to be forming your own response to that statement. And that's where Broca's area comes into play. It's going to decide what you want to say, and then it's going to make it happen. So Broca's area is right next to our primary motor cortex, and that's responsible for voluntary movement. So what are your lungs doing? What shape is your mouth making? How much air is passing through? What's the sort of tension on your vocal cords? All of that would be controlled from the primary motor cortex. And interestingly, the part of the primary motor cortex that also controls hand movements is very, very close to Broca's area. And that's why they think that a lot of people tend to gesture while they talk, because it's the same basic area. So it's very easy to talk with your hands because you're in the same area. All right, and then the last thing I wanted to say was just a little neat note. I was looking back over some of my slides because like I said, I like to borrow figures from other textbooks that do a good job explaining things. And on this slide, I found a note to myself that it's super cool, exactly those words, but children blind since birth will actually have activation in their occipital lobe in response to spoken language. So even though that's the visual area, because they're blind since birth, they've had no need to develop a visual area. And so plasticity allows the brain to co-opt that unused area and use it to process spoken language instead, which is really cool. So it's made use of that extra space. But that's what I wanted to cover today. The next bunch of slides are all looking at sort of sex differences and language functions and differences in hemispheres, all looking at different kinds of imaging in the brain. But rather than sort of starting to figure that out and then figuring it out again on Wednesday, we'll stop here. We'll do our brief refresher of this so we know what we're looking at, and then look at the brain imaging and move on from there.